All right, I think we're ready to begin. Welcome and Falcha. This is July 26, 2020, and Random Thoughts from County Antrim, and I'm your host, David McDonnell. Now, this is the umpteenth week of the pandemic, and I vowed to continue these podcasts at least through the pandemic, and there really is no end in sight, so I'll be doing this for a while. We actually hit 4 million cases in America in the last week or so, which is an astounding number. But that's really not even the big news. The big news, the biggest problem in America today, it's not the virus. What it is graffiti in Portland, Oregon. Now, the federal government responded to the graffiti crisis in the only way it could, and the only way it should, which is federal police in riot gear. Now, one can only wonder where we'd be today if the federal government had responded months ago to the coronavirus with the same amount of intensity. But that's not my topic today. A random thought which popped in my head. My topic today is something far more profound than the coronavirus or graffiti in Portland. It has to do with an issue very near and dear to my heart, and that is the sandwich. Now, y'all know the story about where the sandwich originated, and it goes back to the Earl of Sandwich. Sandwich actually is a town. It's a town near in Dover, in England. And the which suffix, the which at the end of a word, is actually a very common place suffix in England. And it comes from an Anglo-Saxon word, which means a place where trading takes place. And Sandwich in Dover literally means a trading town on sandy soil. That's what the word sandwich means. Now, the Earl of Sandwich, the first man who took the title Earl of Sandwich, was an admiral in the Royal Navy in the 1600s. And as a reward for his good service, the king gave him the title as the Earl of Sandwich. Now, the Earl of Sandwich had a son who had a son who had a son. And for no other reason than that fourth person in that list became the fourth Earl of Sandwich. That was his job qualification, as he was the son of the son of the son of the Earl of Sandwich. Now, this fourth Earl was a card player, itinerant gambler, and he was playing cards one day. This is the story. Playing cards one day, and his servant served out a platter of meat and served out a platter of bread, and he was playing cards, and he couldn't figure out, being the fourth Earl, he couldn't figure out how to have meat and bread and play cards all at the same time. So he told his servant to put the meat in between two slices of bread, and voila, the sandwich was born. And there were others at the same card table or at subsequent card tables with the fourth Earl who said, "I'll take the same as Sandwich has." And that's how the name Sandwich was born. Now, that was how the name originated. Some people give the Earl credit for inventing the sandwich, but it's certainly not the case. For centuries before, in Turkey and Greece and elsewhere, there was a delicacy with meats and cheeses in between layers of bread, and that's been around for centuries before that. The Earl may have heard that or tasted that when he was in the Mediterranean, but we still associate the name with the Earl of Sandwich. Now, that's not even the story I wanted to tell today, and actually I also tried to prove that the Irish invented the sandwich, and I did a lot of research on that question, and unfortunately I could not find any evidence to support the theory that the Irish invented the sandwich. My new theory is that the sandwich was invented by the same guy who invented bread. They've gone together. Meat and cheese and bread have gone together since the beginning of bread. So that's my theory. And only the English would give credit to an Earl for inventing the sandwich. But my story today really isn't even that. My story was sparked by an article I saw online the other day. And the headline referred to the world's worst sandwich. I would have thought that the article was about a bologna sandwich. So it sparked my curiosity, and I read the article. And it turned out to be a story that I had heard before, but had long since forgot. And the story dealt with another example of legislators trying to legislate morality. They weren't trying to legislate their morality. They were trying to legislate the morality of others. And the morality they were dealing with was drinking. Now, the late 19th, early 20th century, and before they had enough votes for prohibition, legislators tried to nibble away at the edges of the drinking problem. Now, some of those were commonly known as the Blue Laws, which restricted activities on Sundays. They got the name Blue Laws, in theory, or at least the belief is, from supporters of Oliver Cromwell. Straight-laced people trying to legislate the morality of everybody, who very commonly wore blue stockings in the British Parliament. So these laws became known as Blue Laws. Now, an example of a blue law that came out of New York in the 1890s, when the legislature was controlled by rural and small-town churchgoers, they passed a law known as the Raines Law. It was named after John Raines, who was a Finger Lakes state senator who wrote the law. And the law did a bunch of things, but principal among them is it prohibited the sale of alcohol on Sundays. Another thing it did is that saloons were required to keep their curtains open on Sundays so that a police officer passing by could peek in the window and see if they were in compliance. Now, there was a serious problem, several serious problems with these laws, or this law, and that was that workers at the time worked 6 days a week. Sundays were their only day off. And this law prohibited them from going to the pub on the only day in which they could go to the pub. And it was particularly insulting and infuriating to New York City's increasing German and Irish population, who are new generation of immigrants to the city. New York Jews weren't happy with it at all either, because they celebrated Sabbath on Saturday, and now couldn't go to the saloon on Sunday. But the problem with the law is not that it affected New York City's working people, because the law was intended to restrict the behavior of New York's working people. The problem with the law is it affected New York's wealthy people. And it certainly was not the intent of the legislature in Albany to restrict the behavior of the wealthy. Now, the wealthy were used to going out on Sundays. That was the one day each week in which their servants had the day off. Now, the wealthy couldn't be expected to cook their own meals, or do the dishes, or clean up for themselves on a Sunday. So what they did typically was go out to eat on Sunday. And they went out to fancy restaurants, and usually these fancy restaurants were located in hotels. The big hotels in New York had wonderful dining facilities. And so the wealthy New Yorkers went out to eat on Sundays at a restaurant in a hotel. And while they were there, they enjoyed a drink or two or three or whatever. Now, of course, the legislature had no intent to regulate the behavior of wealthy New Yorkers. So the Raines Law, the Prohibition statute, the Sunday non-drinking statute, became known as the Raines Law. And the Raines Law had a couple of exceptions. One exception was a blanket exception for hotels. Hotel could serve alcohol 7 days a week. They had another exception that kind of comparable to that was lodging houses. A lodging house, which they defined in the statute, is any facility with 10 or more rooms, could serve drinks 7 days a week, along with a complimentary meal to its patrons. So when they passed the Raines Law, it had a devastating effect on the many, many saloons in New York City for at least a couple of weeks until someone figured out a solution. What they did is they took storerooms in the storage rooms in the saloon, and attic space and basement space, wherever they had some unused storage space, and they converted them into rooms, put up a quick partition, threw in a cot or a mattress, and suddenly, voila, the saloon became a lodging house. And it didn't take much space to make a lodging house, because there wasn't more room in the space than room enough for a cot or a mattress. Now, once the saloons became a lodging house, they could serve alcohol to their patrons, so long as they served with it a complimentary meal. And with this became the Raines sandwich, the world's worst sandwich. And it was a sandwich that was in fact never intended to be eaten. It was a slab of something or other between two slices of bread, and when the waitstaff delivered a pint of beer, they delivered the sandwich along with it. And when the customer grabbed the pint of beer, the waitstaff would grab the sandwich, and they would go to another table, deliver the same sandwich and a pint of beer to table after table. And they make a sandwich, and it would go to table after table after table all Sunday long. And sometimes the same sandwich would be kept and served again and again the following Sunday. Now, I want to give you a quote from Eugene O'Neill at the time. He called the Raines sandwich an old desiccated ruin of dust-laden bread and mummified meat or cheese. And it was indeed the world's worst sandwich. Now, Raines and other legislators in Albany were infuriated with this. And they didn't blame their drafting of the legislation. They blamed the New York City Police Department for not enforcing the law. But law enforcement had other issues to deal with at the time. And they had more pressing issues than Sunday drinking. And their attitude was quite simple. The law says that an establishment must serve a meal. And a sandwich is a meal. The law doesn't say that the sandwich has to be any good. Now, to give you an example of how these sandwiches grew in popularity and how the Raines lodging houses and hotels grew, Brooklyn at the time was a separate city. And they had, at the passage of the law, they had 13 registered hotels. And that number grew within 6 months of the passing of the law to 800 hotels. Now, no travelers ever stayed at these hotels, but that doesn't mean they weren't used, because forcing saloons into becoming lodging houses had an unintended, certainly it was unintended consequences. Because suddenly the saloons were a safe haven for prostitution. Or worse yet, it provided a meeting place for unmarried couples. And that was the use of these Raines hotels. Now, one of my favorite parts of the story is that Senator Raines and his place in history. He was an upstate New Yorker trying to curb drunkenness in New York City. but his name is now attached to the world's worst sandwich. Now, I wish I knew the name of the guy who first thought up the idea of the rain sandwich, because I have a great deal of admiration for the guy. I practiced law for about 30 odd years, and I discovered I had a talent for ways to get around arbitrary restrictions. And sometimes this was easy. Sometimes it took a great deal of creativity. But that's what I did. And perhaps that's an Irish trait. I'm sure the guy who thought of the rain sandwich was an Irish pub owner. But the Irish seem to have that trait, and it's a healthy skepticism towards authority, I think. And I know I had that healthy skepticism. It sometimes got me trouble in school. But I frequently have come across things that are rules simply because they are rules. They don't have any relation to health or safety or any other purpose other than that's the rule. Now, the Irish skepticism to that, it may relate, may go back to the Celtic era. I mean, the Celts had laws and they had clan chiefs, but they weren't necessarily held in awe, and a clan member could tell the chief to bugger off if he really wanted to, without serious consequences. But I think it really dates to the centuries in which the Irish were subject to English law. And English law, as applied to the Irish, certainly was arbitrary. Only the English could own land. Fairly arbitrary if you're an Irishman. The only church legal in Ireland was the Anglican Church. And the king is the king for no other reason than his father was the king. And I think that's part of what created the healthy skepticism. I do want to give you one example of that, which I discovered in one of my recent trips to Ireland. I've been driving through a small village. We decided to stop for one reason or another, and I needed to parallel park. Now, I'm a pretty good driver, and I can parallel park quite easily in the United States. In Ireland, it was a little more tricky. I'm driving on the left side of the road, and I couldn't really rely on muscle memory to parallel park. It took a fair amount of concentration, but I did it. I parallel parked left-hand side of the street. I got out of the car, and I looked about, and I looked at my car, and I realized my parking was just perfect. I nailed it. I was quite proud of myself for having nailed it. And then I noticed a car coming towards me. The car was on the opposite side of the road, so he was on the right hand, from my perspective, the right-hand side of the road. And all the parking spots were taken on his side of the road. And I may have taken the last parking spot on my side of the road. So the driver of that car coming towards me slowed down and then moved into my lane, my side of the road, and then continued onto the sidewalk. Got on the sidewalk, put his car in park, took the keys out of the ignition, got out of the car, and walked into the nearest store. Once he was safely on the sidewalk, all was good. And that's perhaps as good an illustration as any of the Irish attitude towards many, many rules and regulations. And it kind of reminded me of my favorite line in Pirates of the Caribbean, when they were talking about the pirate's code. And the villain, whose name escapes me, said, "The code is more of what you'd call guidelines than they are actual rules." And that, I think, is an expression of perhaps my attitude towards rules and regulations. They're more guidelines. All right, I think I have time. I had one more thing I wanted to talk about. I want to talk about briefly Hillsdale College. Hillsdale is a small town in Michigan. It's near the Ohio-Indiana border. It's an extremely conservative institution. And they call themselves conservative, although they're really not conservative in the historic use of the word. Because the folks that populate the area and hang out at the college and publish articles for the college are really not for less government. In many respects, they're for a more intrusive government. It's just government that's more intrusive in ways that are more to their liking. In fact, if John Raines were alive today, he probably would be awarded a honorary degree at Hillsdale College. In fact, I think they gave an honorary degree the other year or so ago to that bastion of American democracy, Mitch McConnell, who for whatever reason they think has done more to preserve American democracy than anyone else, which is, I'll let you come to your own opinion on that one. But the main purpose of the institution, I think, is to take whatever moronic threads are floating around within that bubble that they live in and make it appear, at least, that it has some academic basis. And they couch these theories in academia so they can justify them. And I wanted to show you, they publish a magazine, or at least a little blurb. It's called Imprimis. And I got on the mailing list for some reason. I don't even know how. But when I get it, I just typically glance at it and throw it in the recycling. Because it's next to worthless. The only way I can cancel the subscription is to write them a note saying, please cancel the subscription. But that would cost me a postage stamp, and I'd rather they pay to send it to me every month than for me to pay one stamp to cancel. But I got the issue this month, and I don't know if you can read it here, but here's the headline. The headline says, 4 months of unprecedented government malfeasance. Now, when I saw that, my reaction was, wow. Even Hillsdale College now recognizes the truth. It's amazing. Even Hillsdale recognizes the incredible government malfeasance, unprecedented government malfeasance going on in our country. And then I read the article. And I only read you the first 2 sentences. I won't read you this whole article. But here's the first 2 sentences. Over the last 4 months, Americans have lived through what is arguably the most consequential period of governmental malfeasance in U.S. history. I gotta agree. The next sentence. Public officials' overreaction to the novel coronavirus put American cities into a coma. Those same officials' passivity in the face of widespread rioting threatens to deliver the coup de grace. And there you have it. The malfeasance is our reaction to the demonstrations, and before that, our overreaction to the coronavirus. I read that and I almost threw up. But what are you going to do? If you want to read the article, you can. I think it's online. It may not be, because these are the same people who think the internet was invented by commies, so they may not even have a website for it online. But you might be able to find it. There's some good points. They deal with the difficulty in deciding what is an essential service and what isn't, and somewhat arbitrary, which I talked about in the past. But the guts of the argument is that the lockdown was difficult and unnecessary. And it was unnecessary because most of the people who were dying were old, or they were sick anyway. And so why would the rest of us have to go through anything that was at all difficult? So take a look if you can find it. I warn you, though, reading it may be as difficult as eating a rain sandwich. Maybe worse than eating a rain sandwich. Now, don't forget, take a look at my website. It's clandonald.net. You can see a link to this podcast and all my other podcasts and some of my articles and writings and articles about my books, some of my stories. Two of my books are here. By the Horse of Guinness and Clandonald, A Storied History of Ireland. Like and share me on Facebook. Send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com. And despite what they say at Hillsdale College, I urge you to be safe, be smart, and do the right thing. Goodbye for now, and Shlán.